Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I did support GIZ, UNEP, GlobalABC in the development of this guide, but I had two very helpful co-authors with me, Dr. Saket Saraf from India and Ms. Ruchi Kapoor, also based out of India. So a big thanks to them, and of course to a lot of detailed guidance from UNEP and GIZ, as well as the experts who provided us a lot of input in the process. Basically, the guide really talks about how it's a how-to guide to adopt 5 different steps to ensure that as your country undertakes this 2025 revision, that the end product of this 2025 revision will be ambitious, investable, actionable, and inclusive. Obviously, this applies to the NDC as a whole, but specifically, the guide is about how to make sure that the content in the NDC related to the buildings and construction sector, i.e., the commitments or policy measures for this sector, are ambitious, investable, actionable, and inclusive. And the guide provides definitions of what that means in this context. Ambition certainly means to increase impact, to accelerate the process, and also include a broader range of measures than have previously been included in the context of buildings. Investable means that the measures and the options must be developed with climate finance eligibility in mind from the beginning. They must be driven by a principal climate change motivation and imperative, rather than being a simple building sector measure that might have a climate co-benefit. It really has to have climate in the heart of it, and of course to have a lot of financial strategies backing it to access public and financial resources. Actionable certainly means that we have to take into account implementation arrangements, governance, ways to measure the progress, and to make sure that it's not really just a commitment on paper, but all the tools are in place to make sure that action is translated on the ground. And inclusive, this is something that has not received as much attention in past NDCs as it ought to have. But the idea is that the development of the commitments themselves should reflect a very inclusive stakeholder process. They should include the views and the priorities of the entire value chain of the building sector, users, developers, everybody. So how does one do this? And the guide puts forward 5 steps to undertake for this revision that will hopefully end with those 4 hallmarks. Step 1 is that before countries even think about what measures to undertake, the question is to say, what are my country's climate change priorities and needs? What is the climate change context and profile of the country, both in terms of its emission levels, of the country as a whole and the sector itself? Where are the major sources? And of course, on the adaptation side, to think about where the big risks and vulnerabilities are. And this really is the evidence gathering stage to understand why the commitments need to be what they need to be, and of course the balance for each country between adaptation and mitigation. Of course, every country will be in its very unique circumstances and will be the best judge of what its climate priorities and needs are. But to provide a simplistic rubric, we did say that countries could be perhaps divided into 3 categories, and this is not sort of least developed country, developing, developed, or low income, middle income, high income. We actually thought that no, countries, it's really about the maturity of the building sector, about the level of sophistication, technical capacity, and governance and policy capacity in the building sector, and how much it has already progressed in terms of taking climate action. And based on that, we came up with 3 categorizations saying early stage market maturities, countries where the building sector is really at that early initial stage of wrapping its head around climate mitigation and adaptation and what can be done. Mid-stage, countries that are part of the way down the line, have some experience with climate action in this sector, but now have a chance to take on more complex actions and increase the breadth. And of course, advanced market maturity, countries that have a long track record, have actually accomplished mitigation results and abatement, and have done vulnerability and risk assessments. And now it's a chance to take a more integrated approach and also start thinking about net zero approaches, even in this 2025 to 2035 timeframe. Once we've done that in step 1, the question is, we've figured out which of those 3 categories the country is closest to. And of course, a country might easily be in more than one categories. But for the sake of making this as simple as possible as a how-to guide, the idea is to say, well, if we are, say, somewhere in that middle category, some of these eight typologies or categories of measures, policy options, will be applicable to us. Of course, all eight might be applicable to all countries. However, depending on the country's climate priorities determined in step one, we might find that for some countries, some of these are more relevant. Countries with a lot of old building stock might find more impact in building retrofits. Countries that are fairly advanced in their decarbonization efforts might find more opportunity in materials and circularity and net zero materials and things like that. So either way, step two is to kind of actually start choosing. These are almost like eight drop down menus of categories of actions. Step three is once we've had a chance to say, well, which of these eight are most applicable for us? We can't do everything that's in under all eight because resources are finite. There's a 10-year time frame. And how do we prioritize? Well, in step three, the idea is to select certain policy options that are most appropriate for that particular country under one or more of those eight categories. Some examples of how this has been done in a comprehensive way are in existing NDCs, UAE, Turkey, Colombia, but this guide also offers, we've done a lot of literature review and sort of helped it become a sort of one-stop shop. So instead of reading scores of NDCs and a lot of other literature, we pulled together some of those policy options right here in this one guide. In the guide, you will find that under step three, each of these categories, these eight categories, opens up into a menu of possible policy options. And we have cross-referenced for ease to say, well, if your country is in sort of early stage market maturity, some of these options marked with an X might be more appropriate as a starting point for your country for inclusion in this NDC. If your country is at an advanced market maturity, then the ones marked with X in that column might be more appropriate for you to take on. Again, the question of what's been marked with X is more about what's a good starting point. If your country has already done those measures and has accomplished them in a comprehensive way, then by all means, go to the next stage or select additional ones. But often countries want to know kind of what is the baseline, the kind of starting point to really make the buildings component of the NDC comprehensive, and that's what this guide offers. So the next several slides, until we get to step four, are just examples of how those eight categories open up with examples of these policy options to choose from and which market maturity level they are tagged with. Step four is once we've actually selected the substantive measures, the technical policy options to say these are going to be our commitments, our actions. What's equally important, but was previously neglected in NDCs, is to say, well, let's also affirm the enabling measures that need to be put in place to effect them. It's not enough to just have a commitment. We actually have to think about how to translate that into action. And for that, we've also offered a 5 categories of enablers, enabling actions that should also be included in the NDC. So under step 3, we're really talking about the what. What should the NDC be committing to for this sector? And under step 4, it's really about the how. How does the NDC foresee the country achieving these? But let's actually be explicit about them and create some accountability about that. So the enablers are, I think there's 5 of them. There's finance and incentives, awareness and capacity building, inclusion, equity and justice, enforcement and governance, and digitization MRV. So again, this is a lot about the how, and these may or may not, wind up in the same section of the NDC that contain the actual commitments, but they should be, say, in a technical annex. They should be an NDC implementation roadmap. But it's important right at the outset to just say how each country is actually going to bring to bear the resources and the systems to actually achieve those commitments. And then step 5 is once we've done that, so we've thought about country context, we've looked at which categories of measures might be most relevant to our country context for this sector. Under each of these categories, we've selected ones that seem to be most appropriate for us. That's the what. And then under the enablers, we've figured out the how, and we've combined all of that together. It's a point to check and make sure that the NDC that we've framed is actually ambitious, investable, actionable, and inclusive. And the guide provides checklists for each of these. So it's a chance to ask some questions and say, okay, the content that we put in, does it reflect X? Does it reflect Y? And if the answers to most of those questions are a check, then it is, in a sense, by default, indicating that your content is, in fact, ambitious, investable, actionable, and inclusive. The next few slides just show those checklists. I'm not going to go through them, they're in the policy guide. But yes, ambitious, investable, actionable, and inclusive. Yes, please. Finally, the policy guide also has a handy blueprint. It's a sort of template for what your NDC section on buildings and construction could actually look like. Again, every country's NDC will look different. One of the challenges in the past has been that the buildings and construction sector often gets subsumed under just a broader energy category. And part of what we're saying is no, it's really important. I won't go through what this blueprint contains, but it offers what each section might contain, including a baseline description, overview of the sector, progress on the previous NDC, specific targets, of course. And then we provide a sort of structure. So it's a tabular structure intended for ease of presentation. A blueprint, as you know, is often a visual representation of the design and the content. And that's the idea behind this blueprint, which is that if the commitments that are selected, the policy options that are selected for your 2025 revision are presented and articulated in this tabular structure, simply by having to organize it in this way and provide these pieces of information, simply by doing that and building this out, you will in fact achieve those hallmarks of ambitious, investable, actionable, and inclusive. And that's it. So happy to answer any questions or comments. And of course, the vast bulk of the content is in the policy guide. So please refer to that.